Hello, everyone. This is the overview for Chapter 3, and Chapter 3 focuses on constructionist theories. So let's get started. I'm going to go over um, summarize the ideas in these major theories. Um, One set of theories that are very well known and have been around for quite a while are labeling theories. And you can think of labeling theory as an umbrella. As you know, if you think about an umbrella, you open it, and underneath that umbrella is you, which is made up of a lot of different parts. Well, labeling theory is like it is essentially an umbrella. There are lots of different theories under that umbrella. But the two central or main ideas are that deviance is influenced by our interactions with others, as well as the meanings or the symbolicness that we attach to or assign to different behaviors. So, um, for example, Edwin Lemert, this is an older theory here from the 50s, 60s, um, identified that are not all deviant behavior is the same. He identified the difference between two types of deviance, primary deviance and secondary deviance. And for Lemert, primary deviance is when a person is engaging in behavior but doesn't think of him or herself or themselves as being engaging in deviant behavior or as a bad person or doing criminal activity, etc. They understand that other people think what they're doing is wrong, but they themselves don't agree with that label. However, with secondary deviance, Lemert argued that if a person engages in a certain type of behavior or behaviors enough, deviant behaviors enough, then eventually some of them will begin to think of themselves as deviant. That is, they will agree with the label that society has, and they will internalize that label. They will now think of themselves in that way as well. So you could think of somebody who smokes pot occasionally with friends when out and about, and then at later point in time identifies perhaps as a pothead or a stoner, etc. That's just a quick example. Um, According to Erickson, there are consequences for both the labeler as well as for those labeled. Now, it's easy to see how there are consequences for people who are labeled by others as uh, deviants, as criminals, as bad people, etc. But let's focus first on what are the consequences for the labelers, the people who are pointing out that these other people are X, Y, or Z? If you think back to, excuse me, the Salem witch trials, I mean, not think back to them in terms of you've experienced them, but if you think back to the historical accounts, um, the people who began to label those young girls as witches, they experienced solidarity amongst themselves and other members of the community who were not acting in strange ways and therefore were not identified as witches. Um, these are people who can think of themselves as good people, as people who deserve to be liked, and they have a sense of belonging within the community. Whereas the people who are labeled, of course, don't get any of that. And there may be very negative repercussions, as we saw in the historical accounts of the Salem witch trials, that many of those girls were tried and many of them were put to death. So, labeling theory is got a lot of popularity among many sociologists because it does help in understanding how once somebody is given a label, they may at some point in time begin to believe that in that themselves. And I've already talked about differential association theory, that idea that if you're around people who are doing bad things, that it's easier for you to do. That's a form of that's a type of theory under symbolic interactionism, which is what labeling theory is. It's all about how do we interact with others and what do people think of us as we interact with them. And here too, in labeling theory, it is largely about how when we interact with others, what do they think of us? How do they treat us? What kind of label do they give us? And whether or not we accept that label um, or don't. However, there are some criticisms, and you can see them here. Of course, there are some sociologists who say that um, the labeling theory doesn't really explain what causes deviance in the first place. Like, okay, we know it happens, but why does it even start happening? It's that chicken before the egg idea. Another criticism is that research doesn't consistently support this assumption that being given a deviant label encourages further deviance. And then finally, um, there's this tendency for labeling theorists to ignore the role of the powerful in imposing labels on the less powerful. And so you could just think about this. Um, when BLM marches were happening quite a bit in the late spring and throughout the summer of 2020, then President Donald Trump labeled these protesters as um, oh, I don't remember exactly the words he used, but he didn't label them positively. Um, on the other hand, on January 6th, 2021, when large groups of people, for lack of a better word, mobs, stormed into the Capitol and destroyed property and chanted "Hang Mike Pence" and all these other negative things about Nancy Pelosi and they were coming for her, etc. Um, then President Trump had a different label for those protesters. And so there is something we often forget uh, in labeling theory, and that is what about the power and the people who have the power to do the labeling? How does that play into whether or not people are viewed as being deviant? Phenomenological theory um, is another theory. And for phenomenological theorists, they are really focused on what people think of their own actions, the subjectivity of people, not the objectivity where we're outside and we're looking at the behavior, but what do people think of what they do, including um, their consciousness about what they're doing, their perceptions about what they're doing. How do they feel when they're doing it? What are their attitudes about what they're doing? Do they feel good about it? Are they feeling guilty? Are they feeling remorseful? Etc. What are their own opinions about what they're doing? And so for phenomenological theorists, they really are focused on what does somebody who is engaging in behavior that some people may think of as being deviant, what do they feel? What do they think? And a big piece of phenomenological theory is using ethnography. Ethnography is a type of research whereby a researcher delves into the community that they're studying. That is, they may live amongst the people that they're studying. They may even engage in some of the activities of the people that they're studying. I was watching the news this morning, and one thing that I saw was a discussion about the unionization of sex workers. And this more recent, it's been around for a while, this push to unionize sex workers, but it's become um, perhaps more of a vocal push. Anyway, one of the people who was speaking about this is a PhD candidate at USC, and she is herself a sex worker. And so that's a type of ethnography. She's doing research and she is, in fact, living the life of a sex worker because she is working as a sex worker. That's how she's paying her tuition. So um, now thinking about another type of symbolic interactionist theory. Um, this is a theory by Erving Goffman. Goffman is a very well-known symbolic interactionist theorist. And his work is focused on something that he labeled dramaturgy. And it's very similar to the idea that um, William Shakespeare had probably 500 or so years ago, in which he stated that all the world's a stage and we're simply actors in it. Essentially, what Goffman says is that when we are out in our various social environments, we are acting as though we are in a play and where we get a script. And Goffman says that there are loosely written scripts that we all have in our heads for different social environments. You know, when we go to school, we know how to act. When we go to a religious um, service, we know how to act. We go on a first date, we know how to act. When we go meet a significant other's parents or family for the first time, we know how to act. When we go to a job interview, there's another script, etc. So what Goffman argues is that much of the time we are playing along with the script. We're essentially acting a part according to what we know society wants us to do. And of course, we may adjust our behavior depending upon how our audience reacts to um, our behavior. Goffman also introduces the ideas of impression management and face work um, as ways in which, as we're communicating with others, we may try to change our behavior to manage the impression that they have of us, particularly, you know, in a job interview or meeting somebody for the first time on a date, etc. But also face work. Face work is when we try to save ourselves from embarrassing situations. Um, he also describes three categories of what he calls stigma. Abominations of the body, blemishes of the individual character, and tribal stigma. And so tribal stigma is the idea that we may be stigmatized because of the group that we belong to. For example, in the past, you know, still today, different racial groups in the United States have what Goffman would call a tribal stigma. Simply because they belong in that group, there's a stigma attached to being in that group. Blemishes of the individual character. If people think of you as a liar, then even though you may not be a liar, that's a blemish on your individual character. And then abominations of the body. If you have a odd shaped, I don't know, nose or head, or your ears stick out, or, you know, any of the things that people often find unattractive. Those are abominations of the body. Critical theory was developed in the 1960s, and you can understand why. There was a lot of social unrest going on, lots of protests regarding the Vietnam War, but lots of women also protesting and wanting more opportunities, various groups of color protesting and demanding more change in society. So all the social unrest got social sociologists thinking about the world around them in a different way, at least some who became critical theorists. Um, for the sociologists who focus on from a critical theory on deviant behavior, they recognize that society is very diverse. It's very pluralistic. That is, we've got all these different um, religions and ethnicities and sexual identities and gender identities and social class identities, etc. And that there are all these conflicts as a result of all of this diversity. Not that that's a bad thing necessarily, but that there are bound to be conflicts because of this diversity. And so the social conflict has to do with the interests that are incompatible between groups. Maybe this group wants this, but that group wants the same resource. And we know that resources are scarce in society, and not everybody's going to get enough of what they want or need. Cultural conflict is more focused on the norms and the values that different groups have. And if we think back to the 1960s, I'm sure many of you have seen documentaries on the 1960s. Younger people typically were more focused on equality and greater opportunity for everybody. They were concerned about war, etc. And older people were more concerned about power of the United States and how the US was going to be viewed, etc. And so today we see there's a lot of cultural conflict as well in terms of people who want the US to be the US of the 1940s and 50s, perhaps, and people who want the US to continue to move toward a very diverse, pluralistic society where all these different groups have power, and that's a good thing, and we have to work together to figure out how to do things. Legal reality theory is another one of under that umbrella of critical theory. There's also social reality theory. William Chambliss um, created this idea based on his research that there are two kinds of law: law on the books and law in action. Law on the books are the formal rules that are actually within the penal code or the criminal procedure code, etc. Law in action is how the people who have the power to impose the law and within the criminal justice system, how they actually discharge their duty, what they actually do with the power that they have given the laws. And Chambliss argued that this was often done in an unfair and unjust way. Social reality theory by Richard Quinney blames unjust laws on the capitalist system. So his is more from a Marxist perspective. You remember Karl Marx was very critical of capitalism. And so Quinney argued that for people who are in the dominant class, they create laws to protect their interests, and they create unfavorable actions or unfavorable conditions for those people who are not like themselves, which then, of course, marginalizes these people. They don't have enough resources or opportunities, and so they then perhaps go out and engage in criminal behavior. All right, so conflict theory. Continuing on with the idea of capitalism being something that perhaps promotes, for lack of a better word, promotes crime. There may be a lot of resentment that builds up because people see that there are some people who are so very wealthy, more money than they ever could possibly need, and yet here they are working really hard and they're still struggling to make it. And that can lead to the development of engaging in criminal activities. And of course, capitalism also allows monopolies to be created, which then means that there may be more corporate crime as a result, because if you have fewer corporations and the power is held in the hands of fewer people, then there may be a greater incentive to engage in corporate crime. And conflict theorists also believe that crime has its roots in inequality between classes, racial and ethnic groups, gender, even religious groups. So all of those things are under that umbrella of critical theorists. Feminist theorists started really in the 60s and mid to late 60s through the 70s, picked up again in the 90s. For early feminist theorists, they were really focused on women as victims of violent crime. And of course, they believe that that is because of our patriarchal society and the subordinate role that women have in society. Feminist theorists more recently have been focusing on women as offenders. It is in fact true that we do see more women committing crimes than we used to. Some feminist theorists have argued that that is because as women begin to have more and more of the same opportunities men do, there may be that same opportunity for them to engage in crime. And of course, some of the crimes are committed by women because they are poor. So they attribute that to the feminization of poverty, because women don't make as much money as men do, even if they have similar skills, education, and training. Power theory really is focused on how people who have power um, are engaged in much more profitable crimes than the people who don't have power. Just think about somebody who goes and robs a 7-Eleven. Well, they may not realize that for the most part, most stores, once a cashier has a register with a certain amount of money, there is a system by which the money is put into this little tube, and that little tube is sent down to a central area where it is put into a safe. So if you rob a 7-Eleven, you're not going to get a whole lot of money, essentially. That's the case. On the other hand, somebody who has a high level corporate job has a lot more opportunity to engage in crime. Now, you may think to yourself, well, why would somebody who already makes a lot of money want to commit a crime to make more money? Well, according to power theory, those individuals have a stronger deviant motivation because they have relative deprivation. This is the idea that if you're making 150,000 a year, you have probably a comfortable life. But maybe there's somebody in a tier above you who makes $225,000 a year. This person maybe has a nicer car than you do, has a nicer office than you do, wears nicer clothes than you do, and you want those things too. That's the idea of relative deprivation. You see what you have is not enough because you see that somebody else has something more. And also, they have greater deviant opportunity because they've got access to power to be able to defraud or to engage in activity that is criminal activity, but it will allow them to be able to get a lot more money. And C, there are weaker social controls because we tend to trust people who are powerful, who are educated, people who are highly regarded. And there are no shortage of instances in the United States in which police officers have engaged in criminal activities. They've used their power to be able to enrich themselves, and eventually many of them get caught. But that's a perfect example of what power theory is saying. Postmodernist theory, this developed in France in the early 1900s. One of the key ideas is in order to really understand crime, you've got to deconstruct it, meaning that you can't just look at the crime itself. You've got to figure out how did that crime occur? What were the elements that were part of the reason why that person engaged in the crime? It's kind of like looking at a puzzle that's been completed. Take that puzzle apart, deconstruct it piece by piece. The same thing with trying to understand crime. Try to take that criminal activity apart, walk it back to the point where you understand the origination of that crime. For postmodernists, they're also very focused on linguistic domination or the way that we use language within society to present certain ideas. And as I said earlier, sometimes the government will call people who are engaging in what they consider to be free speech or engaging in moral activity. The government calls them traitors. Perfect example of this is Chelsea Manning, and Edward Snow. These are people who divulged secret government information because they felt the American public needed to know it. So the same thing happened with the Pentagon Papers back in 1973 or 74. A gentleman by the name of Daniel Ellsberg was working for the Rand Corporation. He was doing work for the Department of Defense. He found out that the US government was in fact lying to the American public about how well the Vietnam War was going. It wasn't going well at all. And so he made copies of all of these documents and turned them over to the Washington Post and the Times. He was subsequently tried for treason. He was acquitted. But those are examples of how, when you think about how language is used and who has the power to label, you may find that not everybody agrees on what deviance really is. All right, so I think I'm going to go ahead and leave. Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and leave it there, and I'll see you for chapter 4.